Hey, church. So my name's Steve. You were kind enough to welcome me into this your family home last week and again this week. And as I did last week, I just want to thank you for the privilege to come and be family with you. Me 24 tells us that if you're a person who has financial means and you find another person who doesn't have enough financial means and they say, can I have some of your financial means because it turns out I don't have very much of it, you should deal with them in ways that don't humiliate them and don't increase their hardship. So here's a group of people, they're living in tents, they only have what they carry around with them from place to place. In all likelihood, dude's probably only got one coat. And if you take his coat as a sign of his pledge, his promise to pay you back the money that he's lent from you, that's a big deal. So the law in Deuteronomy 24 says, here's point number one. Don't walk into the bloke's tent where his kids and his wife and other people who know him are probably hanging out just sharing a meal or resting and take his coat from him in there. That's humiliating him in front of the people who rely upon him for provision. Just wait outside. Wait outside and just say, just bring it out when you're ready. Treat him graciously. And as you go with this man's probably almost most important possession, his cloak, the thing that keeps him warm, the thing that hides his shame in public, the thing that just is a crucial piece of possession for him in his cultural context. Don't just put it on yourself and parade around with it as though it's yours. This is not meant to be a sign of your prosperity. It's meant to be a sign of his integrity. Because he actually gave it to you as a promise that he would pay you back. And if in the middle of a 1500 BC Middle Eastern winter you think, wow, the sun's about to set and he hasn't paid me back yet, just take him his coat and saying, sleep in this tonight. Stay warm. Be well. We're family. It actually sounds like a great way to run a community. Acknowledging as well that in communities, as they become more established, there are people who run businesses and people who work in businesses. The writer in Deuteronomy 24 just says, so pay people what they've earned when they've earned it. Wow, that's a really confronting prophetic word. Actually, it is. Do you know that in our culture, subcontractors and tradies routinely go unpaid whilst developers get unbelievably wealthy? Turns out that's not a new problem. Maybe, wouldn't this be a brilliant thing? People run their businesses as a way of expressing the honour of heaven to other people on earth. People actually say, I wonder how much money I'm making from what you're doing, and I pay you an amount of money that roughly reflects that. And I give it to you, not when it's comfortable for me to give it to you, but when you've actually earned it. Ideally, the writer of Deuteronomy 24 says, before the sun goes down. Because we won't even see the sunset on inequity in the kind of culture that this is building. Every account settled day by day by day by day. That's a pretty good community. And knowing that occasionally people do dumb stuff and sometimes even evil stuff, we need to have some thoughts about how we're going to engage in punishment and retribution. How about this as a rule? We just don't engage in disproportionate punishment or punish those who are innocent. So kids don't die because of things that their parents have done, and parents don't get killed because of things their kids have done. I don't know if you've seen anything on the news in the last 2 weeks. This actually is a massive, profound, confronting word to the darkest parts of what humanity is capable of. It checks our excesses and calls us into the best version of ourselves. Why? Why on earth would we engage in these kind of weird practices that check our excesses and call up the best, most disciplined, self-controlled version of ourselves? The Deuteronomy 24, the writer of Deuteronomy 24 says this, it will be a credit to you before the Lord your God. They, the ones that you might otherwise wrong, would cry out to the Lord against you and you would incur guilt. remember that you were a slave in Egypt and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Why? Why do we live this way? We live this way because our earthly community is actually just an extension of the heavenly community. There's not like a break between how things happen in heaven and how things happen on earth in our nation. Whatever our Father's up to, we bang up for that. In our community, even poverty, even the mechanics of production, even punishment reflect the patterns and priorities of heaven. In our community, there's just not a moment where we start dealing with each other with a harshness and a selfishness. In our community, everything we do is marked by humility, by mindfulness of the other, by remembrance that I was a slave in Egypt. The only reason any of this is working well for me is because my Father has been good to me, so of course I'm going to be good to you. The family I was born into, the education I have, the opportunities, my capacity to handle wealth, do you think I made that from scratch? No. Do you think I'm going to look down on you then for where you are and deal with you ungraciously? No. Humility, mindfulness, gentleness, honour, respect. This is what we're going to become known for. When you talk to the Amalekites and the Egyptians and the Assyrians and ask them about us, this is what they'll say about us, is how the law is meant to work. And so we come then to the second half of what was read to us. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shan't go back and get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan and the widow, so the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, don't strip what's left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, don't glean what's left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this. I suppose in this part of Sydney, I actually can't assume that you don't have olive trees and fields, so maybe this has some immediate literal application for you on your acreage blocks in this part of the world. For most of us who live in suburbia, I have a bare minimum of olive trees in my backyard, and very rarely do I beat them either once or twice. And my field, which I mow in about 15 minutes, doesn't have much in it worth leaving aside for others to come and pick up and take and use for their purposes. But within the culture that the Lord's speaking into, this is exactly what they're heading towards. It's the most natural thing in the world to express humility, mindfulness, generosity one towards the other, because it's that we've received from our Father. The principle that's being built into them here is that they should live life with a margin of space full of something valuable. That's actually a transferable principle across time and across cultures. And whereas you may not have a field or an olive tree, you do have a bank balance and a business and a home and a diary and all sorts of other things in which you can leave a margin of space full of valuable things. I don't think we're very good at it, but it's theoretically possible. My observation of Sydney culture in particular would be we tend to live at the absolute outer limits of capacity 100% of the time. And I hope and I expect, and my experience is that for people who are filled with the Spirit of Jesus, who regularly gather in community to reflect on following in the way of Jesus, we're better than average at creating at least a margin of financial provision for those who are in greater need than us, and a margin of time, one for the other. But I think there's still space for us to become more glorious and more shockingly, prophetically different in the culture that we inhabit. Why on earth would they be doing these things? One of the things they would be expressing when they leave something to glean around the margins of their field, when they leave olives still hanging from their trees, is that providing for the basic needs of the poor is more important than increasing the affluence of my family. Providing for the basic needs of the poor is actually more important than increasing the affluence of my family. This whole thing in Deuteronomy 24, actually it's an embarrassingly bad way to run a business. It's an absolute guarantee that you will be less wealthy than you would otherwise have been had you gone around and scooped up what was left over at the edges of your field or beaten the olive tree a second time. There's no question marks about it. But what you're doing when you do this is expressing that this has become a reality for you, that the basic needs of the poor being met are a higher priority than the further increase of the affluence of your own. Not only is it an embarrassingly bad way to run a business, it's actually a really foolish way to plan for the future. Leave stuff that you could be saving today and worry about tomorrow if and when you get there. That's not the sales pitch for any superannuation fund currently operating in Australia. But if you lived in this kind of way, I think the world would see that living faithfully today, that is, living full of risk-taking obedience in this minute that actually really exists, is more important than building comfort and security for tomorrow, which in all honesty may never come. Which is kind of the point, at least one of the points of Jesus' story about the guy with the full barns who dies overnight and then asks the question, what was all that about? That's a massive paraphrase. Why do I even consider running an embarrassingly bad business model where I know for sure I will end up less wealthy? It's because my Father is mindful of the poor. He hears them, he sees them, he loves them, and he provides for them, and I'm his child. I carry his image, so I see and hear and love and provide for the poor. It's an extension of the reality of heaven onto the face of planet Earth, located in me, in my business, in my home, in my neighbourhood, in my thought life, in the allocation of time in my diary. And when, inevitably, I start to feel anxious about that because I don't quite know how tomorrow is going to work out, I'm reminded that my Father is not only mindful of the poor, he's mindful of me. He doesn't just see and hear and love and provide for the poor. He sees me, he hears me, he loves me, he provides for me. So sometime in around about November 2004, I walked down the corridor of the law firm that I was then working at, repeatedly sacking myself in front of each of the three partners who employed me, and saying to them, I actually don't know how this is all going to work out, but I just have a sense that the Lord's on the idea of running a law firm that doesn't just have some margin around the edge, but is only margin. And I'm just going to run an experiment for a year and see how it goes. I can tell you it was probably the most nerve-wracking thing for my mother that she's ever experienced in my life because of me, because we had one supporter. I counted it multiple times. There was one of them. And I took a 75% pay cut overnight with two children aged 3 and 1, living in one of the more expensive cities on the face of the planet. But my Father's mindful of the poor. And he sees them
and He hears them, and He loves them, and He provides for them. And if my earthly mother gets anxious, the only answer I have for her is that my Father is mindful of me. He sees me. He hears me. He loves me and He provides for me. And I just don't think I can run my own life better than in line with His thoughts on how it can be run well. So I just want to make a million choices that say yes to Him and see how that works out. As time's gone by, I've just come to realise that the margin is where the beauty happens. I had a ball for 10 years in private practice as a lawyer, and I saw lots of beautiful things there as well. But if I look back on it now, I saw nearly all of them in the margin. But it's this idea of creating an intentional space full of something that is actually really valuable to another person, and then letting them come and have access to it. And so for me, that looks like setting up a law firm that's a charity, and letting them come and do that. But you know what? If you're an accountant, if you're a nurse, if you're a teacher, there are mind-bogglingly simple ways of creating margin, space in your life where your valuable skill can come and be gleaned by the last, the lost, the least, the hurting. If you say, well, I'm not any of those things, I want to tell you about my mum. Do you know what she's good at? She's good at things like driving and talking. So you know what she does? With her retirement, as well as tripping off to Norway from time to time, week in, week out, she drives meals to people who are isolated in their homes. She knocks on their door, and if they answer it, she talks to them. It's called Meals on Wheels. It's really spiritual. Do you know what she's doing in that moment, though? She's letting the character of Christ be formed in her, and she is engaging in the process of re-blessing the earth. Do you know what else she's good at? She's really good at boiling kettles. She can boil a kettle for Australia. If that was an Olympic sport, she would be covered in glory and on the front page of most newspapers in our national capitals. And she's unusually good at being around people who are hurting. So as well as spending part of her retirement just enjoying the presence of her grandchildren, week in, week out, she drives to Westmead Children's Hospital and she sits in a room boiling cups of tea and coffee for people whose kids are in unspeakable situations and being present with them in their pain. Do you know what she's doing? She's letting the character of Christ be formed in her and she's engaging in the process of re-blessing the earth, and it's not rocket science. But it's where the beauty happens. Maybe you say, my valuable thing isn't some kind of professional space. Maybe you say, the valuable thing that I have is actually a home where not every room is currently being used. And so we've got a family in our church, Janine and Greg, who have a house where some of their kids have started to leave. They just foster kids. When people are in crisis and homeless, they just say, you know what, we've got a room that you could use. And as they do, Christ is being formed in them and the world is being re-blessed. We've got a guy in our church who's from Ghana, not a super wealthy country as compared to Australia, and he works like a bandit. He drives from like 4:30 in the morning till an unimaginable time at night, just delivering goods from one place to another. How does a dude who drives a van have the character of Christ formed in him and re-bless the earth? He earns more money than he spends on his family. They just live a really disciplined, straightforward life. Good life, but they're very disciplined about what they choose to put their money to. Every week he puts money aside to save, to fill a crate with things for Ghana, and every about 6 months a crate full of stuff leaves Australia and goes across the world to another country full of practical blessing for people who need it. This guy who drives a van is redistributing wealth on the face of planet Earth. And Christ being formed in him, and the world is being re-blessed in the process of him doing this simple thing that the Lord laid on his heart. On Friday of this week, I was struck by another thing. Maybe the valuable thing that you have isn't your professional skill. It's not your money. Maybe it's just your love and presence. We run a face-to-face advice clinic every Friday at Parramatta Baptist Church, and I had back-to-back conferences all day on Friday. We deliberately book people for an hour and a half because when you tell them it's for an hour, but we want to create margins. So we lie to them and give them more time than we ever promised we would. And we always book morning tea or lunch off the back of a conference or the end of the day so that if something beautiful happens, we don't have to push them out the door. And I had this lady come and see us. I've actually been talking to her for a year through our telephone advice line, but I'd never met her before. And I knew from her name that she was from a different cultural background, but I'd never seen her. And she came to Parramatta Baptist Church, and when I went in to say hello, I saw that she was a veiled lady. She's a woman from the Muslim faith, and she wears the hijab. And I said to her, because I'm a unusually confident, gregarious Australian man, "Hey, how are you? I'm Steve." And she stands back from me and says, "This is how I say hello," because in her culture, a man and a woman who aren't married to each other touching is not okay. So awkward moment number one. Thanks, Frosty. You can gradually learn how to become less offensive to other cultures, one awkward moment at a time. And anyway, I say to her, "Well, look, I know you've brought in some things for me to read. How about I grab them from you? This space that you're sitting in, which is also the waiting area for the pastor's offices, this is probably more comfortable than our waiting area next to where I am. So you just stay here. Bathrooms are there. They can give you something to drink. I'll be back when I've read your paperwork." I'm a slow reader. And so it was about half an hour, 40 minutes later when I got back to her. And I must say, as I walked out the door and left her sitting in that waiting room, she wasn't the most comfortable looking person on the face of planet Earth. And it actually caused me to think, so if I was in legal need and the lawyer that I was seeing was located in a mosque and took my paperwork and left me sitting in the waiting area for the sheikh's office, I probably wouldn't be feeling all that comfortable either. Which says far more about me than it does about the sheikh. But when I came back 40 minutes later, this lady is sitting there, leant forward in conversation with Kathy Bates, who's the lead pastor at Parramatta Baptist Church, just chatting about goodness alone knows what. And I say, "I've finished reading your stuff now. Do you want to come back round to the office?" And she stands up, she shakes Kathy's hand, and she comes around and sits in my office, and we do boring legal stuff for, I don't know, an hour or so. And at the end of our time together, what she says is, "Thank you for making me feel so welcome." And then she kind of looks around this space that we meet with people in and she says, "It's so peaceful here." In a fortnight where Muslims and Christians haven't necessarily been expressing welcome and immersing each other in peace all that much, it struck me as a good moment. And I went back in after she'd left and I said to Kathy, "Thanks for making her feel so welcome while she was waiting. That's just so brilliant." And Kathy goes, "Yeah, she was just asking, like, how do I piece all this together?" And Kathy said, "So yeah, we were just talking about how church is like a community with loose edges." And I'll probably die with the recollection of Kathy sitting there talking to this lady being one of the last half dozen images that flashed through my brain, because beauty happens in the margins, and I love beautiful things. Why does beauty happen in the margins? It happens because it's in the margins where the last, the lost, the tired and the hurting come to meet Jesus and from him glean life. The margin of time and money and skill and home is where the last, the lost, the tired and the hurting come to meet Jesus and from him glean life. And anyone can do it. That's the joy of the gospel. It's not for the great and the mighty, it's for the every man, the every woman. each carrying the blessing of God into the nooks and crannies of the world that they inhabit, that others could never reach. I'm going to pray, because I think I may have mentioned before I quite like praying. So for these brothers and sisters, Father, this family swept up in the great adoption of Jesus and filled with the Spirit of adoption, your Holy Spirit, I pray a supernatural broadening of their thoughts about how they can give expression to the character of Christ in themselves and play their role, the one shaped just for them in re-blessing the earth. We thank you, Father, that you just refuse to give up, that you are tenaciously reaching out, stooping, brooding and burrowing into every place on the face of this earth, working to bring new life and fresh blessing. Can you just help us to be the kind of people who make that easier for you to do, not harder? Who make it located in our offices, our neighbourhoods, and our sports centre, as well as all the other places that you're pulling it off. Amen.